I'll call the meeting to order of the Legislative Audit Commission Audit Subcommittee, today being November 13th. So welcome everybody to this commission hearing today. We have the Office of the Legislative Auditor's Financial Audit Division report, and there are two reports on this agenda to be that have already been released today. One is the Board of Architecture, Engineering, Land Surveying, Landscape Architecture, Geoscience, and Interior Design. I think we call that the alphabet one. And then we have the Minnesota Management and Budget, the U.S. Bank Stadium Reserve Account. So we'll be starting with the first one. And welcome, Mr. Busey. Glad to have you here if you want to go ahead and get started on presenting the first report.
Madam Chair, committee members, for the record, my name is Christopher Busey. I'm the Deputy Legislative Auditor for the Office of the Legislative Auditor's Financial Audit Division. I'd like to start by thanking you for taking the time to have the hearing today to give our reports some visibility that they certainly deserve. This is the first 2 of 10 discretionary audit reports that we will be releasing over the next month and a half. Today we're going to be talking about the Board of Architecture, Engineering, Landscape Surveying, Landscape Architecture, Geoscience, and Interior Design, a small agency with arguably the biggest name in state government, and we'll also be talking about the U.S. Bank Stadium Reserve. For a little bit of context, one of the things that I've mentioned at the full Audit Commission is that when we use the term discretionary audit work, this is work that we pick internally within OLA with your help and with other input as well. This represents about 1/3 of our total audit resources on discretionary audit projects. But we also have a bunch of required audit work as well in state law. We have 9 required audit projects in the hopper as well. Those reports will be released also starting in December, and the financial audits will be coming out all the way through February. So there's quite a bit of work in the hopper. In total, there's 19 projects in the queue for the Financial Audit Division. So I'm going to start off with the board. And before I turn it over to Mr. Scott Chumsland to talk about the detailed scope, objectives, and the findings of the audit, I think it's important for us to circle back and just think about why we do these audits. And in this particular case, we go through a process in picking discretionary audit topics where we look at items that were brought up to the Program Evaluation Subcommittee that may have had financial objectives. We look at our complaint files. We look at suggestions that came in from internal staff. But arguably one of the most important things that I look at are what are topics that members of the Audit Commission think are important. And this is actually one audit project that we put on the agenda because a member of the Legislative Audit Commission felt like we needed to go out and get some visibility into some of the smaller entities, and in particular, the member suggested that we come out to this one. We also have several other projects in our work queue as well that fall in that same category. One that was also suggested by the Audit Commission was the Smart Board, which will be coming out next month as well. It's also important to get coverage. This entity has not had any audit coverage since 2006, so that was the last time we had a presence in this entity. There were several findings that we presented in that audit report, but we also feel like it's important to get coverage in smaller entities. The fact that the legislature goes out, does audit work in these entities, it's an important control. It helps all entities across government, not just those that spend millions or billions of dollars per year, but it helps all entities know that the legislature cares about what they're doing and that we are going to be going out and examining their operations on a periodic basis. Madam Chair, committee members, with your permission, I would now like to turn over the presentation to the Audit Director over the project, Mr. Scott Chumsland.
Welcome, Mr. Chumsland. Glad to have you here today. And for the audio record, just restate your name and title for the record, okay?
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Scott Chumsland. I'm an Audit Director in the Financial Audit Division of the Office of the Legislative Auditor.
You can go ahead.
Thank you. So the objectives of the audit were to determine whether the board had adequate internal controls to safeguard its assets and ensure compliance with applicable legal requirements, and to determine whether the board complied with those legal requirements. The scope of the audit included activity between July 1st, 2016 and January 31st of 2019. The results of the audit were mostly positive. We concluded that the board had generally adequate internal controls and that the board generally complied with those legal requirements. However, we did have 4 findings that we did include in the written audit report. The first finding is actually a repeat finding from our last audit in 2006. The finding is that the board collected fees that significantly over-recovered the costs of its operations. State law requires licensing boards to set their fee amounts at an amount that is as close to the break-even point as possible when compared to the cost of its operations. State policy also requires that those fees be reviewed and reassessed biennially. I will mention that nothing has really changed since the last audit. The board's fees are set in statute, and those fees haven't changed for several years. The board does not keep the fees that it collects. Those fees go into the general fund as non-dedicated receipts, and the board receives general fund appropriations to pay for its operations. We provided on page 9 of our report a graphic that shows the amount of over-recovery of costs at in the biennium that was both completed during our audit scope and the 4 bienniums completed since the last audit. So you can see that it's been a consistent problem at the board as far as over-recovering costs. We're recommending that the board review its fees each biennium in accordance with state policy and also work with the legislature to consider reducing the fees to get those more in line with the actual cost of its operations.
Mr. Chumsland, in regards to that, have the fees increased over this period of time, or have they stayed the same?
Madam Chair, I think they've been relatively consistent. Perhaps the executive director could answer that more definitively, but I think they've been relatively consistent since that time.
Okay, so Mr. Chumsland, when I see that there's an increasing amount that 289, 1 million, then 1,000,003, then 1,000,004, 1,4, and 1,3, is that because they've reduced their expenses? The appropriation has been reduced?
Madam Chair, that could be part of it. It could be differences in the number of licenses. There could be fluctuations in the number of licensees from year to year.
Okay, we'll have an opportunity for this board to respond today, so we'll wait for them. You can go ahead for the next recommendation or finding.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Finding 2 is related to some shared costs between this board and the Board of Accountancy. Currently, the executive director position for each of those boards is a half-time position, and the same person fills both of those positions. So as a result, the payroll costs for the executive director is split evenly between the 2 boards. However, the cost of the executive director's parking space was not split evenly between the 2 boards as intended. Instead, the Board of Accountancy paid the entire amount of the cost of that space, which was about $4,400 during our audit period. So we're recommending that this board pay for half the cost of that parking space. The third finding is related to reimbursements to board members for travel expenses. We found one instance where the amount of travel expenses reimbursed to a board member was excessive compared to other individuals that took the same trip. It was a trip to a conference in Indianapolis that was attended by 6 board members and the executive director. 5 of the board members and the executive director all had pretty consistent costs as far as the airfare and the amount paid per night for the hotel. 1 board member had costs that were nearly double the cost both for airfare and the nightly rate at the hotel. We did not see any documentation that would explain why those costs were so high. There were no documented extenuating circumstances that would seem to justify the extra cost.
Okay, thank you.
Our recommendation is that, I should mention, I'm sorry, that we do believe that based on our testing, this was an isolated incident and not indicative of any kind of pervasive problem at the board. We are recommending that should an unusual circumstance like this occur in the future, that the amount of reimbursement be limited to a reasonable amount. The fourth and final finding in the report is related to contractual requirements related to professional and technical service contracts. We found a couple instances where the board did not comply with certain procedural requirements. Specifically, there was one contract just under $50,000 for which the board did not retain at least 10% of the contract amount until the final payment, which is a requirement in state contracting law. And the board also did not submit a vendor evaluation report to the Department of Administration, which is also a requirement for contracts that exceed $25,000. There were two other contracts completed during the scope of the audit, both for $5,000. And for one of those, the board also did not retain at least 10% until the final payment. So a recommendation for those is that the board develop procedures to ensure that it complies with the retainage requirements and the vendor evaluation report requirement.
Thank you, Mr. Chelmsland. I appreciate that report. Before we go into the next topic, I would rather have a response from a Zlogid board, that we would have them come up and just give a response to these findings and recommendations. So if you want to come forward. Again, state your name and your title for the record. And then what I'd like to have you do is, for each recommendation, I know in your submitted response, there may be some information, but I think it's good to have it officially on the record. So just respond to each one of the findings and recommendations, if you could.
Excellent. Good morning, Senator Kiffmeyer, members of the committee. My name is Doreen Johnson. I am the Executive Director for the Board of Architecture, Engineering, Land Surveying, Landscape Architecture, Geoscience, and Interior Design.
Ms. Johnson, our microphones, you really need to lean into them.
Oh,
Your
my
voice is so soft, we're having a hard time hearing, so.
I rarely am told I'm soft, so
There
I
you
will
go.
correct that. Thank you.
There you go, much better. Thank you, Ms. Johnson.
Do I need to repeat that, my introduction? Do I need to
Yes,
repeat it?
please.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Doreen Johnson, and I am the Executive Director of the Board of Architecture, Engineering, Land Surveying, Landscape Architecture, Geoscience, which is Geology and Soil Science, and Certified Interior Design. I'm also the Executive Director for the Minnesota Board of Accountancy. I am split 50% between both those agencies, and I say that because that will explain part of the reduction of our expenses. My report in response to the legislative audit is obviously included. I'd like to address first the over-recovery of fees. We are in agreement with that. The board has reduced its requests for appropriations, although it has asked for additional appropriations as well. When we combined with the Board of Accountancy, some of the expenses were cut as far as staffing. When you look at our overall staffing, we have a staff of 6.5. We also share expenses with an agency, so we have split those costs over that time frame. But the bigger issue is our fees do need to be looked at. One of the things that the board and we have been over-recovering. We've had an increase in the number of licensees. That's been a big part of the finding. However, some of the things that are still set in statute are already being corrected. For example, with technology, we now have direct registration for some of the applicants going directly to the National Council. And while our fees were recovered during that time frame, we anticipate not collecting those fees because they will be going directly to the National Council instead of making repeat applications to the board. But we have been over recovering costs based on the statute. The full board got the report this morning, and they will be addressing those findings and looking at the 2021 legislative session. You may ask why we're not doing it this session. We are in the process of doing strategic planning in the next couple of months, and one of the issues that the board wants to look at is removing friction points to the application process for applicants. While the exam fees we can't reduce, we can look at reducing things like the application fees for some of those students that are entering the field, and we will be addressing those issues. And so I have listed that as the 2021 because we will also be coming in with our budget recommendations at that same time. The second finding was paying half the cost of the executive director's parking space. That has already been corrected once it was brought to the attention, and that was an oversight. Let me see. Oh, the expense report that was overpaid for one of the board members, as I brought to the attention of the legislative auditors, although it was still deemed to be excessive, it came in under the special expenses for the entire report. So when I looked at that, our board member did make their reservation at the last minute, and they are volunteers, and it still came well under the special expense report that I had designated for that trip, and made a business decision to pay that, and did not go back to the volunteer board member and say, you need to pay for this. So that may have been an error on judgment, but it was a business practice decision, and it was still under the special expense. In the meantime, we've taken steps to, we now have a travel agent where all board members have to go through that. So if they're not in compliance with doing it within 30 days, I will be alerted before the meeting rather than submitting the expense after the meeting. I've listed that as December 2019 because I've not brought it to the board yet to say we will also have a policy in place that I will be contacting the board chair if there's any unusual expense reports. The final finding for the professional technical contracts, this was an error on my part. The way the contract is written, it says we have to retain 10% until the project is done. One of this is dealing with a psychometrician for particular exams, and when the exam was done and the work was done, I did pay the 100% of the bill thinking that it was done. In reality, that was an error on my personal interpretation, that it was to be withheld until the end of the contract. So that was an error, and we have something in place to correct that. And the evaluation, quite frankly, I received the evaluation, and on the day I got it or the week I got it, it's an evaluation, and I deleted it and didn't do it. Quite frankly, I thought it was an evaluation, and thank you, but I have plenty of things to do on that day that it wasn't the evaluation, and I did not complete it. So that will not be happening again either. And it was an error. So that's been already completed. So the only thing that has not been done is the evaluation of the over-recovery of fees, which we'll be doing in the next 2 years.
Thank you very much, Ms. Johnson. I appreciate that. Senator Rest?
Madam Chair, what standing committee in the Senate oversees your budget?
State Finance.
Ms. Johnson?
I apologize. Senator Kiffmeyer and Senator Rest. Let me see. House Finance, and I'm drawing a blank on the Senate. I apologize. It should be in my head, and it's not.
I think it's state government.
Thank you.
State government. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And the audit finding that I find the most disturbing is number one. You had 10 years to correct that audit finding, and you didn't do it. It's a prior finding. It was a finding from 2006, and you still didn't do it. I really find that unacceptable.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rest. Representative Erickson?
Thank you, Senator Kiffmeyer. Ms. Johnson, how many licenses have been issued since 2006? That would probably be a reason for this overage. Can you tell us that?
Ms. Johnson?
Senator Kiffmeyer, Representative Erickson, and members of the committee. I can't answer off the top of my head. Our average is a little under 20,000 licenses for the 7 professions on a biennial basis.
Madam Chair.
Representative Erickson?
Thank you, Senator Kiffmeyer. So, Ms. Johnson, each one of these groups has a different fee schedule. Is that correct?
Ms. Johnson?
Senator Kiffmeyer, Representative Erickson, the members of the committees. No, their annual renewal fee and their application fee is the same for all 7 professions. What varies is the exam cost that is laid out in there.
So, Madam Chair,
Representative Erickson.
thank you. So, Ms. Johnson, is the exam fee then collected and put also in your overage?
Ms. Johnson?
Senator Kiffmeyer, Representative Erickson, and members of the committee, the exam fee that we collect is, I think the only one remaining is the local land surveying exam. That's the one that's different. The rest of the exam fees get paid directly to the National Council. They used to be a pass-through, and they're no longer a pass-through. They get paid directly as we've done online applications.
So, Madam Chair.
Representative Erickson.
Thank you. My last comment, actually, this is a comment. It would seem to me that some reform needs to be made, major reform here, considering the number of licenses issued, and now some can go directly to the national. I think that this organization, this board, is going to have to dig down and determine how they can stay within the parameters of the statute so we don't have a violation of this law. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Erickson. And so the challenge, Ms. Johnson, is the fact that these fees go into the general fund and then you receive an appropriation. Many other boards have a special revenue account where the fees go into that rather than the general fund, and it's a little bit easier to track those direct expenses. I would encourage you to include that in your proposal. To change from general fund to a special revenue account, and then those matching expenses and those, and many other boards have that, and I think that is also very helpful. The challenge is always, since this money goes into the general fund, even when you reduce your expenses and you reduce the fees, it's the general fund that feels that effect, and then that can be an interesting consequence and a little bit harder to deal with. I would encourage you actually to consider doing some of these fee changes for 2020, because 2021 is a budget year. And once those things are baked into the proposed budget, then it can be even more difficult to manage that change. So if it is done next year, especially if there's a general fund surplus, then we're kind of able to do the special revenue fund and make some of those changes, but that will help set up for that future budgeting year. I think some of those things you may need to, I just want to give you that information, that you talk that over with your board and with your members and so on, and consider that. One of the questions I have specifically for you, though, is since some of these fees are going now directly to national instead of a pass-through to you, how much money might that be, and would that already decrease the overage? Ms. Johnson.
Senator Kiffmeyer, that was prior to the 3 years, but I'm reflecting the 10 years that's being addressed.
All right, okay, so that would not have an impact.
Correct.
All right. And then I think the rest of the things you've responded to, and I appreciate that, but I think the major thing here is to rectify an audit finding from 2006. It's actually 13 years going on 14 years, and I think it is time to clean that up. And you are the lucky one, Ms. Johnson. How long have you been the executive director with this board?
Senator Kiffmeyer, members of the committee. I've been with this board. I was the first investigator that came on board in 1996. I became the acting executive director in 1998. Approximately 15 years ago, the Board of Accountancy wasn't generating enough revenue, and they assigned me the board, or they requested that I take over the Board of Accountancy as a courtesy temporary fix, and I've had the Board of Accountancy ever since. So since I've been with state government since 1996, I consider it a great privilege. I believe in what we do, and I love my job. Regulation is important.
Good. Appreciate that very much, and just some more work for you. And this is one of the benefits many times of an audit. I know they do a good job. They do things well, but are a help to you if you had to go out and hire the same sort of thing done, an analysis. But this way, I think it is helpful to you, but nevertheless, some additional work, and this is certainly one of those that's overdue. Thank you. Ms. Johnson, you want to make another comment?
Yes, I would like to say something. Senator Kiffmeyer, no one enjoys an audit. It's an onerous process, but having been the director of the auditing board or the Board of Accountancy for many years, it's a critical component of state government and to good business. So I would really like to commend the entire team. I mean, it's nerve-wracking. You don't ever want anything, to be addressed, but they were extremely helpful, and as I have said, that if I didn't believe in the audit process, I shouldn't be the executive director of the Board of Accountancy. They handled it in a very professional fashion, and I think one of the best things is the recommendations they made along the way. So I'd like to say thank you.
Good. Appreciate that, Ms. Johnson. So with that, members, report accepted, and glad to have you here today.
Thank you.
So with that, we'll proceed to our next item on the agenda. This has to do with Minnesota management and budget, but it's in particular the U.S. Bank Stadium Reserve account. And so again, we have Mr. Busey from the Deputy Legislative Auditor for the Finance Division, and Mr. Ryan Baker, the Audit Coordinator. So welcome again. And Mr. Busey, if you want to go ahead and introduce.
Madam Chair, committee members, I'd like again to thank you for giving us the opportunity to bring this report in front of the committee again today. This is an important report. I'm going to bring Mr. Ryan Baker up with me. I'm planning to do the testimony today on this report, but Ryan Baker helped me with this audit project. Very much like Mr. Nobles, with the size of our staff, we don't have the luxury to just delegate the work always to different members of our team. There's a lot of times when I don't just get to be the conductor, I also have to play an instrument, and this was actually one of those where I did a lot of the work directly with assistance from Mr. Baker. I'm going to be doing the testimony today on this report, but because Mr. Baker helped with a lot of the real details in the weeds, if you have questions that go beyond what I know, I'm going to have Mr. Baker help me out with some of the testimony as well today.
Thank you, Mr. Busey. You can go ahead.
Madam Chair, committee members, once again, I'd like to start off by talking about why did we do this audit. And this one was interesting because it didn't come through the normal channels. This was an audit that we put on our docket based on a complaint that came in. And initially, it was actually last winter, we got a complaint from a member, in fact, a member of the Audit Commission who came to me and mentioned that that member had got an allegation that the Department of Minnesota Management and Budget had illegally transferred $20 million out of the U.S. Bank Stadium Reserve. Now, in the Legislative Auditor's Office, we have a rigorous process for managing complaints and different forms of allegations. And what we do is we do a preliminary assessment. We decide, are we going to do a special review? Is there going to be some other way we're going to manage it? Do we have jurisdiction? All those kind of things. But in this particular case, when we did our preliminary assessment and looked at the complexity of this area, I felt like it was important for us to actually put this on our discretionary audit list as a topic for us to do a full audit report on. It was important because of the complexity of the area. When you look at the U.S. Bank Stadium financing, it's phenomenally complicated. There was a series of laws that were passed both in 2012 and 2013 that have serious financial implications, and we thought it'd be important for us to go through and do a thorough audit of this area. In addition, there is a lot of cost. The annual expenditures are about $41 million as well, and in the end, I thought we'd do a service to the legislature if we put this together in an OLA audit report, and whatever the results would be, at least the legislature would have a really good artifact that they could use going forward to help people understand all the ins and outs of the U.S. Bank Stadium Reserve account. The objectives of the audit were twofold. First of all, we were looking at all the revenues into the account to make sure that the revenues that were being put into the account complied with the law. And we also looked at all of the expenditures as well and made sure that those were authorized expenditures under the law. And moving on to the conclusion, this is an example that doesn't happen very often, but our conclusion on this audit was completely clean from the MMB perspective. We felt that the Department of Management and Budget complied with the law. And I think that's a pretty noteworthy accomplishment when you look at the complexity that is in this area. They have some pretty stellar accountants that are dedicated to working on this area, I think primarily because of its visibility. But this is an audit where we traced all the revenues, we went through all the expenditures in the account, we made sure things complied with the law. And overall, we found that the department complied with all of the myriad of financial related legal provisions that are underlying this area. And then secondly, I think it's important to note that the original claim that the department illegally transferred $20 million out of the account, we found no basis for that claim. I think I know why somebody came to that impression, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. So just starting with a little history of the account was created to cover shortfalls in amounts that are deposited in the general fund to cover the stadium-related expenses. If you look at the diagram in the slide here, you can see that the balance in the U.S. Bank Stadium Reserve has fluctuated since its creation in 2013. But at this point in time, the account balance is sitting at about $44 million in the reserve. When you look at the different revenue sources that come into the account, the 2012 legislation really anticipated that gambling revenue would be the primary source to pay the stadium-related expenses. There also were some other sources added by the 2013 legislature. If you go back in time, back in the 2013 era, there was some questions about whether gambling tax revenue, the excess revenue from the new games, was going to be enough to cover the costs of the principal and interest payments and the other stadium-related payments. And the legislature added a couple different sources of revenue. As you can see by the slide, they gave the Commissioner of Management and Budget, in consultation with the Department of Revenue Commissioner, to transfer in up to $20 million a year of corporate tax into the stadium reserve account. It's not mandatory that they do that. That's optional based on whether it's needed. And they also established a one-time tax on cigarettes that were in possession back in 2014. It was a per mil tax on all stamped cigarettes, and then on cigarette stamps that were not assigned to packages of cigarettes yet at that point in time. As you see by the slide, in 2018 now that gambling tax revenue is starting to increase, we brought in about $58 million last year in revenue into the stadium reserve account. When you go on the other side and you start looking at, well, what are the required expenditures of the money? One of the things you'll notice is that, as you'd expect, the bond principal and interest is the primary item. There's about $30 to $31 million a year in debt service payments that are actually going out. But there's some other important expenditures that you need to understand as well. First of all, going out today are payments that are made on behalf of the City of Minneapolis. There's a requirement to pay money to the Sports Facilities Authority for operating expenses, for capital expenses. Both of those expenditures are actually liabilities of the City of Minneapolis. The state is paying them now, but in 2021, the City of Minneapolis will be providing the state with money to cover those expenditures, plus they will be helping recover some of the money that was paid up front as well. So those line items are listed as an expenditure, but there will be money coming in down the road from the City of Minneapolis in order to cover those expenditures. There's also a couple other provisions in law. There's money that goes out for compulsive gambling treatment. And then there's also money that goes out for the City of St. Paul sports facilities as well. One thing that's important to recognize on this slide is when you start to look at the account in 2016, 2017, and 2018, the total expenditures out of the account are starting to level off right around $41 million per year. So it's important to keep in mind that annually going out of this account now is about $41 million, and that amount is going to be fairly stable now going forward. The account is projected to grow, and that is despite the fact that in 2019, the Commissioner of Management and Budget and the Commissioner of Revenue made a decision to no longer transfer in the $20 million of corporate tax. And I'm speculating that the decision not to bring the $20 million in corporate tax into this account any longer, which the commissioners had the authority in law to make that decision, I believe that was the impetus for the complaint that came in, where people felt like there was an illegal transfer of $20 million, but in fact there wasn't. Money just wasn't transferred into the account, and the commissioner and the Commissioner of Revenue also had the authority to make that decision. And based on the balance of the account, it was certainly clear that that money was no longer necessary to make the required payments. But there's some other factors as well that are important to understand if you want to understand why this account is going to be growing in the future. And first of all, it's gambling tax revenue. When I looked at the projections of gambling tax revenue starting now and going into the future, every single year, the gambling tax revenues are going up about $7 million more than the year before. And in fact, starting in fiscal year 2019, the year we're in today, gambling tax revenues alone would be sufficient to make all the required payments in the account. Also, starting in 2021, there will be about $18 million of additional revenue coming into the account annually from the city of Minneapolis once they start making their required contributions that we talked about earlier when we looked at the expenditure table. So when you look at the pictorial view of the account going forward, the projected accounts balance in the U.S. Bank Stadium Reserve is expected by 2023 to grow to about $193 million if there are no changes made. So circling back to the conclusion on this report was a very positive conclusion for MMB. However, in this report, we did make some recommendations that we think will be helpful for the legislature. First of all, particularly given the projected growth in the account, we think the time is now, while the balance is $44 million in the reserve, to start having some strategic conversations about where we're going to go with the account. And it was interesting when I was doing some of the briefings for this report, one of the questions that I got was, well, what is the right balance in the stadium reserve? And you can't answer that question unless you understand what the strategy for the account is going to be. And that's why I think those strategy conversations are so important. So, for example, if the strategy for the account is going to be just to have enough money to make the debt service and other required payments, well, then we need about $41 million per year, and the revenue from the gambling taxes far exceed that amount starting in 2019 going forward. So you can reduce the amount of gambling money going into the account, and you can still make those required payments. However, conversely, if the strategy is going to be that we are going to use this account to stockpile some money to help the stadium down the road to make capital improvements, or if we want to retire some of the debt early, then the strategy, then we're at the path that we're on now, where we're going to be bankrolling some money and putting some money away is the appropriate strategy. The key thing from the legislative side is that the conversations really need to happen so that people can make sure that we're on the right trajectory. Another item that we pointed out in the report for the legislature is that in the laws that were passed in 2012 and 2013, the enabling laws for the Stadium Reserve account, there were some checks and balances that were put in the legislation that provided that if the commissioner of MMB was going to tap the balance in the Stadium Reserve account, so it's not the required distributions, but if there's going to be anything that taps that cash balance in the reserve, there has to be a consultation with the Legislative Commission on Planning and Fiscal Policy. And that happened twice during the scope of our audit. In 2015 and 2016, it's before gambling tax revenues were really increasing substantially. But the commissioner, in order to make the required payments, did have to tap into the cash balance in the reserve. And he sent a letter in both cases to the Legislative Commission on Planning and Fiscal Policy. And he said, this is what I'm planning to do. Unless I hear differently from you, then that is what is going to happen. The problem that we saw with this arrangement is that the Legislative Commission on Planning and Fiscal Policy had not met since 2013. So the control that's in law to have this consultation with the Legislative Committee doesn't really work if that committee doesn't meet. And then finally, an area that we pointed out in the audit dealt with the accounting practices. When you look at all of the detailed requirements for revenues and expenditures, you see terms in that legislation that they're required to create an account, they're required to deposit money in that account. But one of the things that's interesting about this area is that there is no U.S. Bank Stadium Reserve account in the state's accounting system. The account balance is tracked on an Excel spreadsheet, and it's a big spreadsheet, and I spent many nights studying that during the course of this audit. It's right. So they're doing a good job accounting for the activities on that spreadsheet. But we talked about this, whether this really met the spirit and intent of the law, where the legislature said deposit and used some of those terms that made us believe that there should be a real account in the accounting system or some kind of accounting construct, not tracking the balance on a spreadsheet. But one of the things that MMB pointed out to us is they showed us some provisions in their enabling legislation that gives the commissioner of MMB a lot of leeway to use accounting constructs that the agencies fit to best manage an area. And they felt that because of the complexity of the law and other reasons that the spreadsheet was the best way to go. And they have that authority in law to use these alternate accounting approaches. So in this finding, one of the recommendations that we are making is that the legislature, and your staff members, I think it's a good thing to look at if you're going to have the strategic conversations about where we go with the U.S. Bank Stadium Reserve. I think there also can be some conversations about whether the accounting construct really provides the necessary openness and transparency to really follow the activities. You know, I have to reemphasize, though, I did spend a lot of time in the spreadsheet. I felt like the spreadsheet is right. They're doing a really good job managing the spreadsheet. The question is, do you need more visibility by having a real account in the accounting system or a special revenue fund or some other type of construct? So to conclude today my testimony, we think it's going to be important for the legislature to have the strategic conversations, to look at the accounting construct, and then the one check and balance in law. We do think it's important for there to actually be a real consultation with the Legislative Commission on Planning and Fiscal Policy. And if that's not the right committee, then maybe it's important to look at a different committee that will have that consultation that's required in law. And finally, before concluding, I would like to once again give a word of thanks to the help that we got on this audit with the members of Minnesota Management and Budget. It's not very often that we see an audit that has a completely clean opinion. So I do like to call those out because it's pretty rare that we don't have any audit findings that are directly related to the agency. And I felt that they did a really nice job on this in this area.
Thank you, Mr. Busey. Appreciate your comments, and yes, it is indeed welcome to have a clean audit and to commend MMB for that being the case. Senator Rest, I have some questions, but Senator Rest, you go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm curious about what kind of costs would be established, what kind of costs would occur if there were a change from a spreadsheet-based accounting approach to a real account. Is there a cost, or would it be netted out at zero? I mean, is there an efficiency in using the spreadsheet-based accounting as opposed to having a real account? And throughout, there's the indication of the complexity of this whole law, as well as presenting the figures, which apparently MMB has done a great job at. But it's not, I'm assuming, it's not immediately accessible to legislators to understand that spreadsheet-based accounting. And would it become more accessible if it was a real account in your judgments? I do think it's the first recommendation about having hearings about the future uses of it. The one that strikes me immediately is pay off the debt. And you can do all kinds of frou-frou things, if you will, at some other point. But paying off the debt seems to me to be the fiscally responsible action, given that there may be there still may be fluctuations in the amounts coming from gambling. That, you know, if we have a recession, do people gamble more or gamble less? Is the account threatened by that? Interested in your opinion on that. And that, is it the case that the Legislative Commission on Planning and Fiscal Policy hasn't met since 2013? Really? I mean, I'm not being critical, I'm just curious. They don't meet? Does anybody know?
Well, Senator Rest, it's stated so in the audit report. I
know.
would take that as factual and truthful.
Well, then, what is the point of it, would be my question. And if it does, I mean, we have other commissions that meet rarely. They generally have been established to make legislators feel good about something, and then no oversight really occurs. But it seems to me if this commission is going to have any meat to it, that we should consider legislation that requires them to meet at least quarterly. We do that with, I was trying to think of a commission or a group where we, well, I know, this one. Madam Chair. the
Senator
audit-
Rest, I don't think this commission is in any trouble with the amount of meetings we
No,
have.
I understand that. No, the audit subcommittee, I think, is required to have a quarterly meeting or a hearing or something, and we certainly meet that. But why not them? And it has nothing to do really with the stadium account in that regard, except that there are other things that they oversee, I believe, that perhaps slide by, no, not slide by is wrong word, that are ignored, that maybe shouldn't be ignored, and that particular commission is the appropriate one to examine any number of things. As I understand it, the chairmanship of it goes back and forth between the Senate and the House on a biennial basis, and the members serve ex officio. I mean, who they are listed in the statute. So, very interested in your recommendations, and maybe the spreadsheet-based accounting approach is better, more efficient, less costly, but if it's not accessible to members of the legislature in plain language, more or less. It seems like to me that it may well be what generates suspicions, like that occurred with the $20 million transfer, and or lack of transfer, however you want to look at it. And if we had something that was more transparent, the question wouldn't even have arisen about the authority of MMB and the Department of Revenue through the Commissioner's office to take those kinds of actions.
Mr. Busey, for your response to points that you feel you can. Just to mention, members, we will have MMB come forward and they can address some of these as well. Mr. Busey?
Senator Kiffmeyer, committee members, one of the things I've learned now is that you bring a pen with and you write down the points. And so you asked a question about cost, transparency, what to do with the money, and then finally the committee oversight. So I'll start at the top with the cost question. State of Minnesota's got an enterprise resource state-of-the-art accounting system. There's no cost to adding more accounts, and we can create as many accounts and accounting constructs as we want. So the cost question wouldn't be dictated by whether our accounting system could do it. The question comes into play is, does it create more administrative burden on the staff and cost from added administrative burden? I think that's a question that will be something that we'll have to leave to MMB to address. But one of the key points about accounts in our statewide accounting system is generally accounts in our accounting system are tied to legal sources. And that's what makes this challenging, is that there's a lot of different legal sources for the revenues, for the required expenditures. So it's not going to be possible to create one account that accounts for all the activity in one spot, because there are multiple legal sources involved. However, there are other accounting constructs that could be used. For example, you could put this money in its own dedicated fund, for example, where you have accounts where the payments are made out and where the revenues are put into that account. So there's different accounting constructs that you could create, but because of the multiple legal sources, you won't be able to create just one account in the accounting system. So that will be a good thing for MMB to address. The key thing for this audit is we did look at the spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet is right. It works, which goes to your second question of transparency. From our perspective, if we would have had, for example, one fund to look at, and we could see all the revenues that were going into an accounting construct, the expenditures going out of the accounting construct, it probably would have been a lot easier to do this audit. But we were able to successfully do the work with the spreadsheet, tracing everything back to their legal sources. So, the question will be, are enough people looking at this data on an ongoing basis that need instantaneous access? From what I was told, anytime MMB has been asked to provide the spreadsheet, they've provided the spreadsheet. And in regular budget updates, they've also made it clear what the account balance was in the stadium reserve. So it's going to be a balance of how much work it is and with the need for transparency. Moving on to your question, what to do with the money? The best response that I can have to that is that I think that's really a role for the legislature. And the question that I struggled with when I was making that recommendation is, it's really not clear which committees even would be the jurisdictional committees. Clearly, MMB falls within the state government wing and the Senate and the House, but there's other committees that are out there as well. The law already dictates that additional spending decisions are made by the Legislative Commission on Planning and Fiscal Policy. And by the way, they didn't meet. And then there's also other committees that I think are important as well that I put in that final chapter in the report so that there was context. There is a legislative commission on Minnesota sports facilities as well. And they are a body that really has some jurisdictional oversight for the Minnesota Sports Facilities Authority. A challenge with them is they haven't met for multiple years either after the stadium's been built. So I tried to lay all of these issues out in that governance chapter to help frame the decision. And I think that's the best thing we can do sometimes as a legislative auditor's office, is provide a report that's accurate, objective, timely, and useful so that you can do your job better as policymakers by having us do some of the legwork to tangle out some really complicated situations. This is one area I'm a CPA with over 30 years experience, and this area was taxing for me to really get my arms around with all the laws and all the complexity. So I was pretty proud we were able to put the document together for you, and hopefully that serves as a useful resource.
Thank you, Mr. Busey. I do have a more specific question in regards to, let's see, page numbers here. It's one of your first, the revenue sources, slide 23. So the question I have for you is on the cigarette floor stocks tax. That's what it's labeled here. And you mentioned that was a one-time. So my question for you, was it one time that it went to the stadium reserve, but the tax continued and it then went to the general fund? Can you clarify that, Mr. Busey?
Madam Chair, committee members, it's my understanding, this is a one-time tax that was put on the distributors, manufacturers, jobbers. In the report, I have a footnote reference to the actual law, so it was a one-time tax that was put on these organizations to raise money one time to go into the U.S. Bank Stadium Reserve. It was designed to raise $26.5 million, and that went into the account in 2014 as a one-time infusion of cash at a time when revenues weren't coming in from regular gambling taxes.
Thank you, Mr. Busey. My main question was, did the tax continue? And my understanding from what you've testified today, the tax itself did not continue.
Madam
Mr.
Chair,
Busey.
Madam Chair, committee members, you are correct. The tax did not continue.
Okay. And then on slide number 28, MMB used part of the reserve balance in 15 and 16. Can you tell me what that reserve, what that money was used for and the reason why it was taken out of the reserve balance in 15 and 16? Mr. Busey.
Madam Chair, committee members, in both fiscal year 15 and fiscal year 16, there was not enough revenue that came into the account that year to make the required payments. So you almost have to look at this account in annual slices. Every year you have revenue, every year you have required expenditures. And if the required expenditures can't be made with the revenue that came in, they have to tap the balance. And that's what the commissioner did. He basically went to the bank account and said, we are going to use part of the cash balance to make our required expenditures in both of those years.
Okay, thank you very much. That really helps to clear that up. Let's see. I would say in regards to the account, I look at it as the legislation required MMB to create the account and deposit the revenue in that account. I think as you have testified, Mr. Busey, there is a way, and it doesn't mean you can't even use a spreadsheet to do some of the manual, some of those things that may need to be done, but to still have an account in the state's accounting system. I think it is certainly something that can readily be done. And I think maybe as things have come into stability, I'll wait to hear from MMB in regards to that, but I think it might be time for that to be complied with, just as we've talked about the alphabet board in regards to some of those things. I think certainly MMB can be responsible for that as well. With that, members, other questions? Representative Erickson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, Mr. Busey, this is something you don't have to comment on, but 16A.53, subdivision 1, very poorly written. and I know that my party was in the majority, so I take umbrage with how that is worded, and I think that MMB could find a way to get to what they did with the spreadsheet based on the May, but also some of the other language. This is very convoluted, and so I hope that state government finance will consider rewriting the statute so that it's clear and that there is accountability and transparency built in. Those things happen. I know the stadium issue was one that was debated and very controversial, so, maybe this was quickly put together, but sometimes we legislators don't put together the best language that is clear and concise and has that key element of transparency in it. And you don't have to comment on it. It's just my comment that I am disappointed to read how convoluted this is. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Erickson. I appreciate that. Mr. Busey?
Madam Chair, committee members, I would like to comment on that. And there's lots of situations that we come across in audits where you look at a situation, you think you're comparing what is to what should be based on the law, and the agency, points to some other law that gives them the authority. And that's the case that happened here, where they pointed us to, some provisions in their enabling legislation that allowed them to do this. One of the things that I did is we want to present the full argument then. And we can't say that they're wrong because they have the authority in law to actually have that alternate accounting approach. But by laying it out in the audit report, it helps you understand the logic so that if you choose to do something as a policymaker to change the way the enabling legislation works, you have the authority to do that and the information.
Thank you, Mr. Busey. We appreciate that. With that, we will transition over to Minnesota Management and Budget. Commissioner Franz? Welcome, Commissioner.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you. Glad to be here. Myron Franz, Commissioner, Minnesota Management and Budget. Chris, you didn't have to leave. I'm happy to have you up here with me. I'm a little hesitant to comment after such a report. It's a bit like when I was in private practice and before a judge, and in the middle of my argument, the judge ruled, yes, your case prevails, Mr. Franz. I learned to sit down and say, thank you, Your Honor. So, but I do want to thank Mr. Busey and the office of OLA for the report that they put together, because Mr. Busey and I had a number of discussions about sort of the role of this report and how it can be used as a framework going forward, because I think we should just take one moment, and we've talked a little bit about this in terms of the complexity of this situation, because 3 of the members of this committee were there in 2012 when this was passed, and in 2013 when the tax changes were made. I know Senator Ress was at that table in the conference committee. So what we have is this unbelievably complex arrangement, both in terms of legality and accounting procedures, and I think we should take a moment to all of us be proud of what we were able to do. I know, as Representative Erickson mentioned, it was controversial in many ways, but what we did was put together one of the largest public-private partnership investments that this state's ever made. And we now see it being run very professionally and in a way that we're proud of in terms of the Super Bowl and the Final Four and managing the facility as a first-class facility. So the reason we're in this situation today with the clear finding from the OLA review is that we took this very seriously from day one. And I think that was one of the reasons we wanted to be able to be here and testify at some point about this process. We knew, and Brian Dahl, I'll have him come up in just a moment, the Director of Budget Planning, we knew that this was going to be hard to follow. We knew with these different legal sources of funds coming into this to the general fund, we would have to account for it, and we wanted to set up a system that would do that as transparently as possible. But one of the reasons, I'll get to this right away, one of the reasons that an account was not set up in the typical format is that we only set up accounts when appropriations can be made and paid out of that account. We have no spending authority out of this account. And so typically, any account has a spending authority from that account to be made. As you know, when we did use the funds, we had to go to the Legislative Commission on Planning and Fiscal Policy to seek recommendations to make that change. So no money can be spent out of this account without some legislative approval or recommendation. So that's one of the reasons that we followed the path that we did. And so there are a number of ways to make this more transparent, but I think one of the things we've also done with every forecast and every budget, as Mr. Busey mentioned, is we always have the balance of the stadium reserve on the budget documents, but in the forecast we always show and give information to the legislative fiscal staff about the status of the reserve account and what's happened. So there's been a lot of discussion about this over the last number of years. So even though there may not have been some hearings, there's been a lot of discussion behind the scenes. And even when we notified the Legislative Commission on Planning and Fiscal Policy in 2015 and 2016 about the need to use some of the reserves to make the annual payments, we always call the members, and I know I personally called, if not all the members, most of them, and we also sat down with fiscal staff. We never would send a letter over assuming we would get a response or no response. That's not the way that I personally conduct myself as Commissioner of Management and Budget. So we've tried to always consult with and be available to fiscal staff. But so I think the key here that I just want to start off with and then take your questions and deal with other issues is, what's the best way going forward, given the fact that the system worked? The stadium's been built, we're maintaining the stadium, and now we're having revenues in excess of what we need from the charitable gambling in that account, and that refund or that fund account is growing. What do we do with that going forward? I think you know me well enough by now to know that I like fund balances. I like things to have a balance in them. We've been working hard to have budget balances the last number of years, to have a budget reserve that's almost full, over $2 billion, and this is another example where we have overachieved, if you will, and we have to decide what does that mean. Number of options about paying the debt back early in 2023 or other uses. But that, as Mr. Busey said, that is a legislative decision, consultation with the governor for you all to decide, well, what's the best use of this money now that we're at this point. The great thing about this report at this time is that we do have 7 years now of good history of where we are. The expenditures are pretty much leveled off. We know what they're going to be, and we know we're going to get some more funds coming in 2021 from the city of Minneapolis. So I feel really proud of the way that MMB has over the years accounted for this process, discussed this process with legislative fiscal staff, and I want to thank the OLA's office and Mr. Busey in particular for the painstaking way he went through this. He's right. It's hard, and I never really have a meeting about this without Brian Dahl in that meeting with me as the Director of Budget Planning, because it's really hard, and if you don't keep yourself centered on those accounts and those legal requirements, you can get lost really easily. So with that, let me open it up for questions, and if you like, I could bring up Mr. Dahl to talk about the accounting system too.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Appreciate your comments. I would say that probably from this report, what I understand more clearly is that it's not that you took money out of the reserve, it's that you didn't take money from the corporate revenues to put into the reserve. And I would have to say that was probably a fair amount of confusion. And I appreciate the legislative auditor's work and in a very trustful sort of way on our behalf to confirm that. So it wasn't so much any money was taken out, such as 15 and 16, where that was done in accordance with law. But in regards to these corporate revenues, it's just that they weren't put in, not that they were taken out. But I would suppose that on the revenue side, when you see that little chart, it shows it not coming in. And so, but I think it just points up to the fact that this is one of those that is a bit challenging. And maybe now that we have some kind of plateauing and you've got the spreadsheet kind of doing, and I understand you're not actually writing checks out, so I can see that. But I think something a little more or a lot more transparent and visible might be very helpful, because what we don't want to have is, due to its complexity, have continuing questions that are there. I don't think our counting system should be that way. It should answer questions without some of this. So your expertise, also others as well, can be applied to that. And since this is generally in the purview of the State Government Committee, I'll work with you in seeing, I don't know that we necessarily always need to change a law, but I think we should clean this up so that this, at this time and in this place, with having done this work, that we clean some of that up and have a way forward. And because once you've done this, I've experienced this, once you go through this and you have these members here, this is the time to do that, not leave it to a potential whole new legislature, and then they have to get familiar and read a report that's a year old. I think it should be to us at this time to be the ones to clear it up, whether it's statutory or accounting, that we can work together. Do you have any comment about that, Commissioner?
Madam Chair, members, no, I really appreciate your openness to discussing this. I think our goal is to make sure that, well, number one, that we get the clean report that we did, but then the second thing is to, if we can make it more transparent, more easy to follow, we are with you on that, and we'll work with you to come up with a mechanism to do that, because I understand, and I think that's something we need to do generally, improve on, and I know Senator Coran and I have had discussions about this too, and that is to make sure that we present to the public the most clear data possible so they can evaluate what we're doing and why we're doing it and where the money's going. So to the extent we can help with that, I pledge my work with you to do that.
Thank you, Commissioner. I appreciate that, and we'll look forward to taking that pathway so we can chat or schedule whatever needs to be done, email, phone calls. There are a variety of ways, but I would say your expertise in your office is very much needed in this regard to make a recommendation to the legislature that we can review and work on, because you had that specific expertise that we can do. Senator Rest, I see you kind of.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm curious, Commissioner, about the level of responsibility that's going to be undertaken in making payments by the city of Minneapolis. It's been my experience at least twice when we have passed legislation that obligates some entity, usually some government, at some level, that will take on an obligation in the future, and that meanwhile, the state will pay for it. Whether it's a parking ramp, whether it is payments at the Mall of America or the city of Bloomington. Do you have any assurances that when 2021 comes, that the city of Minneapolis is not going to ask to be forgiven their payments?
Senator Rest, great question. Commissioner, a tough one for you.
Madam Chair.
Any
members.
inkling?
Well, no, I think, to be clear, I have no inkling that they're going to do anything other than perform. Let me say it in a positive way. I have full confidence that they will perform the requirements under this statute. We're in regular conversations with them about maintaining the ongoing payments to the stadium, so they know their obligation, they understand how it's calculated, and I have full support, full confidence that Minneapolis will supply its funds.
Madam Chair, that hasn't
Senator Rest.
always happened in the past, and so I think we need to make sure in our discussions with all the parties and all this complexity that an agreement is an agreement, and that we do our share, and that all the other parties, including the Vikings, which apparently they've done, everybody else that was a party to this legislation holds up their end of the bargain. And I think we need to be aware of that as we approach 2021. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rest. Commissioner.
Madam Chair, for the record, I'm not personally guaranteeing Minneapolis' payments.
I understand that.
I think that was a very important clarification, Commissioner Franz, so I appreciate that. You know, one of the things that I just want to make a comment here, and this isn't really necessarily for you, Commissioner, but just the fact that the questions that have been answered by this audit are just really important, considering these complexities and what Mr. Busey, with all his knowledge and expertise, has had to go through to do this on your behalf, Commissioner, is tremendous value, and we just really appreciate that. And that was one of the first questions, are they being accounted for and all of that? And I'm very grateful that that question is answered in the affirmative in a very good way, and so commend you and your staff for accomplishing that. The one thing that when I take a look at this gambling tax revenue, my district, I know across the state, are charitable gambling folks out there who have done a tremendous amount, 4-H, Boy Scouts, ball games, you name it. They are the ones that do a lot of the work to bring this revenue in. They keep pennies on the dollar for the work that they do and the value that they give to their local communities. So while I appreciate the stadium and all the things that that is going on that we value there, I do know that our local areas all across the state of Minnesota who do a tremendous amount of work to bring in this gambling tax revenue and the work that they do and the value that they give to all of our communities from inner city Minneapolis to throughout the state, that if there is excess here, I'm just going to place it and say that our local charitable gambling folks, if there is an excess here, then I think we should take advantage of making sure they are compensated and that all of those local charities are able to have local support in a greater degree than they are today. Senator Rest, I didn't know if you were looking to.
No, I was just watching you, that's all.
Thank you, Senator Rest.
I
Oh,
don't have anything to say.
okay, I appreciate that. With that, however, on what's on our agenda today, there's certainly some things to work through, and maybe Commissioner, sometime in the next week, 2 weeks, or 3 weeks or so, I don't want to lose the momentum and nail this down, that you and I have a conversation, and that I'd like to hear your thoughts and next steps and what we can do for increasing that transparency. In particular, I think that's in your particular area.
Yes,
And that I would like to have, if we can, have something ready to take the time now for the session this year, if we can just kind of follow the 360 and just get it completed and taken care of.
Well, Madam Chair, I think I have the perfect agenda for that meeting that we're going to have soon, and that is we will sit down with that spreadsheet and we'll walk it through. And I think because you do need to, come to terms with that and figure out how do you transfer that into something that other people can see more transparently. So we'll do that soon. I
Okay.
appreciate it.
I'll look forward to that, and also to consider something like a special revenue account. There are ways that we can make this simple and not necessarily so complex, considering this unique situation, and yet get to our goal of greater transparency. And I love doing spreadsheets. I am my father's daughter, and I just hate to say, my dad would read tax code books in the evening and read my mom juicy tidbits. And I have to say that's, for his customers that came to him to do their taxes, I'm sure that was a really good thing that he was reading tax code books in the evening as Mr. Busey was reading your spreadsheet. So I will look forward to that. Thank you very much, Commissioner. And with that, members, I think we've completed our work without any other further comments or questions. We are adjourned.